Welcome back to the Empowa Podcast. My name is Blane, and today we'll be talking with Olu Olanrewaju and Femi Adewole from the affordable housing company THC or TAHC, I think. Is that how you pronounce it, TAHC? A Nigerian company focused on affordable housing investment and management in sub-Saharan Africa. Olu and Femi, thanks for joining us on this podcast.
It's a pleasure to meet you, Blane.
Thank you, Blane.
No worries. So in today's show, we'll be kind of introducing TAHC and also introducing you guys and your professional background. So I think to start, we'll begin with introducing each of you. So maybe Femi will come to you first for an introduction, and then after you, we can go on to Olu.
Okay, thank you, Blane. My name is Femi Adewole. I'm an advisor to the African and Affordable Housing Company. I trained as an architect about 35 years ago now, but very quickly, after about 5 years practicing as an architect, primarily in the residential sector, moved into housing development. A lot of that career was in the affordable housing sector in England. And after doing that for about 20 years, came back to sub-Saharan Africa, first to support the government of Lagos State in Nigeria with a large-scale housing program. And subsequently went to work for Shelter Afrique, which is the Pan-African Housing Finance company, for another 8 years. In the last 4 years, up until the end of October, I had been leading Nigeria's largest affordable housing fund, the Family Homes Funds. And upon retirement from active service at the end of October, I have commenced supporting the affordable housing company.
Awesome. Olu, over to you.
Funny enough, Femi's career chimes mine in the sense that I've had nearly 30 years of working in the housing sector in the UK. I've held a number of senior positions in some of the largest housing companies in the UK. Until about 6 years ago, I decided to move into consultancy when I joined one of the sort of foremost UK housing advisory firm called Altair. And part of my joining them was to help them to set up the international practice. And so I currently, in my day job, lead the Altair International advisory services, which provide housing-related advisory services across the globe, but primarily in Africa, and we've done some assignments as well in Asia. By qualification background, I'm a chartered surveyor. So my background is in planning and development. And then outside of sort of the day job, I hold a number of non-executive roles in property management companies, as well as a number of charities as well.
Mm-hmm. Okay, interesting. I've got a list of questions here relating to affordable housing, and then I guess how it links with specifically to Nigeria. I'm going to go through them, and I guess instead of each of you can just respond however you want to. I don't think we need to go Olu and Femi, just we can be pretty organic about it. But considering each of your professional experiences, I might kind of tap into your insight into, I guess, a lot of people in our community are aware of the systemic issues in affordable housing across the African continent. But maybe, obviously, because a lot of us, these are people outside of Africa, a lot of them, it's hard to, I guess, understand what those challenges are. So from your perspective, what do you see as being some of the biggest systemic failures in the affordable housing sector in Africa? And can you give some examples of how those challenges have manifested in practice?
Well, okay. There are quite a number.
Pretty big one to start us off.
Yeah, let me start with the big one. I think perhaps the biggest one is land. I think most people perhaps don't appreciate the essence of land to the African. Land is essential to being who you are, your humanity. And therefore, in a number of African countries, fairly Western models of land ownership have been imposed on very strongly held traditional beliefs about land. And when you then plan to put development on that, it becomes a major problem. So, for example, in Nigeria, where I work, but I think this replicates itself across many countries. Local people believe that they own land. So the notion of a law that transfers all land to the ownership of a government is not one, even after 40 years, that has been well received. And the implication of that tension and uncertainty around land ownership is that it makes development extremely difficult, but also expensive in most of Africa because there's uncertainty about the land title, there is uncertainty about the cost of land, there's uncertainty about who owns land. And then you then have to, in many cases, deal with communal issues. So this is a very big issue that significantly undermines both development, but also the scale of development. So that's, I think, one big one, given that every development, including housing development, starts with land. I think before Olu comes in, let me mention the second one. The second one, I think, is probably the absence of and the failure, in some ways, to have developed strong institutions that have sufficient capacity and robustness to manage the risks that are inherent in housing development in sub-Saharan Africa. So just to kind of give you some data around that, again, if I use Nigeria as an example, we have almost no development company that is able to complete 500 homes a year. And this is in a market where you have a population of 200 million people. So most of the development companies are quite small. They are quite poorly capitalized, which means that they're really unable to manage the risks that are inherent in development or even have any significant economies of scale. It also means that they are likely to be very poorly managed and poorly run and unable to pay for superior quality services. So again, that poses a very significant systemic challenge in the housing space in sub-Saharan Africa. I'll just stop with those two. There are a couple more, but I think I'll let Olu come in. He's familiar with the markets.
Oh, no, thanks, Femi. I mean, the other big one, I suppose I will add to that, is the absence of affordable finance. There's absolutely no issue about the housing need is there, but we don't have effective demand. So there's no effective demand in terms of people having access to affordable housing finance to enable them to exercise that demand. So housing finance, then also you also then look at the other side of it in terms of project finance, so that even if you fix the land, the fact that the developers, the cost of finance is just so expensive, it means that it is very difficult to get large scale volume development going, because, and especially affordable housing at a large scale. Then, of course, it's not unique to Africa, but there's also the other wider macroeconomic challenges around inflation, cost of raw materials, building skills, as well as, especially if we're looking at your question from the point of view of not just producing housing, but the ability to produce housing at scale that is much needed, then you will argue that actually the macroeconomic environment and the absence of that also contributes significantly to the challenges Africa faces. Then the other bit of it is political will. It's not usual to see, and I always smile to see a lot of announcements from government saying, "Well, we're going to build 100,000 units this year or 250,000." I don't even know where these people get the numbers from. But like Femi said, in an environment where you don't have a developer that actually produces 500 a year, so there's a mismatch between that policy or political intent and the political commitment to put in place the enabling framework to deliver those numbers, and also to be realistic about what that system can deliver, so that you don't have these sort of table tennis with numbers that take place on a regular basis. So those would be some of the big issues from my perspective.
So, Blane, let me just come in with one final one. And I thought I'd just keep this back because for me, it's perhaps the biggest one. Conventional housing finance includes a series of presumptions. One of those presumptions is that you have a developer who builds and you have a buyer who accesses a mortgage or something of the sort to buy the houses. And this is a conventional Western housing finance model, which works where you have a very highly formalized economy. For most of sub-Saharan Africa, again, I have to use Nigeria as an example, we have close to 80% of people in the informal sector. That is a scenario that conventional housing finance has never really come to terms with. And I think that is deeply systemic. In trying to find a solution to housing in Africa, we need to be looking at a housing finance framework that serves a population where an overwhelming majority are both in the informal sector, but are also on very low income. How do you fund these people?
Interesting. So maybe let's expand on that one in particular, because that one's quite relevant, I guess, to what we are doing. So it seems like, if we look at the population, I think you mentioned 80% of the population has informal employment, informal income. And for those sorts of people, it's hard for them to access the traditional financial systems there, which aren't really made to serve people with informal employment. Is that right? So the financial systems there aren't actually fit for the people in the countries that they operate in. There's a mismatch there. So a solution.
Yeah. I mean, Femi is right. I think the point being made is that the traditional underwriting standards are not designed for informal sector. They designed for formal arrangement where you got certainty of payment. They can look at your payment track record. You have access to data. All these sort of credit checks that you and I are used to, whether it's Australia or New Zealand or the UK, or in some cases, obviously, or in African markets as well. But those are the sort of formal tools that is based on predictability, because what you're getting is long-term finance, and there's a sort of predictability. Somebody's trying to risk assess your ability to pay over a long period of time. When you're in a market where not only that 80% of people are informal sector, but significant people are also poor. But at the same time, it must be said, which is this interesting point, we shouldn't lose the fact, even though it's an informal sector, there's still a lot of people that have enough income streams that it may not be recorded, but enough income stream to sustain payments and to meet their obligation. The issue is always that we never have enough data to, at the beginning of that transaction. What you always find out, as the example in Mozambique with Castle Real Assured, post-sales, people then display behaviors, either accelerating payments or in some cases with incremental housing, building quicker, because they're accessing funds and resources that are not formal or that are not recognized at the beginning. So because it's informal, we need to be careful that we don't always associate it with being poor and not being able to afford, because you go to some of the houses or where people live that are operating in the informal sector, decisions they're making in terms of where they send their kids to schools and all that stuff. It shows you that there's a mismatch between what is termed official income and actually the lifestyle people are living. And so I think we just want to convey to your audience. I'm not saying that's universally everybody, but being informal does not necessarily mean that people are poor.
Yeah. I think that's a point.
I don't know whether Femi agrees with that.
Yeah. Well, maybe Femi, do you have any points on that? Thoughts on that?
No, absolutely. I think there are two different things. Informality. There are very wealthy people who are in the informal sector, and there are very poor people who are in the informal sector. Just as we have very poor people in the formal sector and very rich people in the formal sector. It's about earnings, regardless of which sector you are. But I think it's important to overlay that. I think Nigeria recently published its livelihood survey late last year, and about 73% of the population were deemed to be having multi-dimensional poverty. Okay, so generally speaking, most of sub-Saharan population are also not just only informal, they're also vastly on low income, on no income. Two separate things, but vastly on low income. Of course, it must be said that in a big population like Nigeria, even the 20% or so who are not classified as being on low income amounts to 40 million people. So that itself, that's a big market, which we have not even sufficiently addressed.
So that 40 million person market, what did you categorize? What did you say that market was? People that were
who are not classified as being multidimensionally poor.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. But still potentially in the informal market or the formal either?
Some in the informal market, some will be in the formal market. Yes.
Okay, but there's still a significant portion of people that could be in a position where they could afford to take out a home loan. Yeah. Absolutely. Okay, interesting. I think another interesting point that you brought out earlier was around the fact that not many housing developers have the capacity to develop more than, say, 500 homes per year. And then you kind of contrast that with some political statements saying that they're going to build 100,000 homes per year. So there's like a mismatch there. And when we are looking at Empowa, like our end goal is, we've financed 30 homes in Beira, Mozambique at the moment, and we've got a contract or agreement for another 25,000 homes. But the end goal is 50 million because that's currently the backlog. But it's hard for us to, I guess, get to that point where the housing developer capacity is kind of bottlenecked at kind of 500 per year. So what are some of the reasons why that capacity doesn't go beyond that 500 or per year or like 100 homes per year? Like, what are some of the major causes for that limitation for houses developed per year, in your opinion?
I think maybe Olu will jump in here, but I think my sensing of that is that itself is a systemic issue. So where you have a problem with land, where you have a largely informal population, and then where you have a very limited amount of financing, particularly exit or demand side financing, it means that you really can't build very much because you can't sell very much, because there are not many people who can buy very much. And therefore, you are acculturated to only building what you think the limited demand financing available can take. And therefore, if also you organize your structure to build 100 houses or 50 houses, because that is what you safely think or believe rationally that the market can absorb. And so the fact that we don't have developers who are able to build 30,000 houses a year, like you have in some parts of Europe, and in fact in some parts of North Africa, is basically because if they build 30,000 houses, they will go under because it's going to be difficult for them to sell these houses, because who will buy them possibly don't have access to financing that will enable them that's affordable for them to buy these houses. But my view is that if you sort out the financing issues and people can have access to affordable financing to buy their homes, I think the market will respond and developers will scale up to build much more units. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with that. I think the example I always use to explain that, where you can see that if you sort out the end user finance, you open up the market. It's always been I don't know the situation in Australia, but in the UK, I remember nearly 30 years ago, it's unique. It was totally unique to see people buying expensive new cars. Everybody I knew was always buying second-hand car or third-hand car, whatever. But the moment the car manufacturers ended up putting in place a financing system that allow people to lease cars, it's actually the reverse now, which is that most people now have access to new cars because that financing system is being resolved. So it's opened up the market significantly, and the car manufacturers, as part of their sales, are not even telling you to go and find finance. They sort out the finances for you. So that's an example from me where I can sort of attest to what Femi is saying, that if you fix the end user finance, and my sense is that once you also create big scale developers, the pressure on getting government to fix the land constraint will also come in parallel, because this will be big businesses that will have influence and also will ensure that, because land is more or less the raw material for real estate, and inevitably will then try to put pressure on government to unlock, in my view, a lot of those issues about providing land and sorting out, especially service plots, to make it easier, or land banking to make it easier for those developers. And then the third part of it is that real estate is a very expensive business. And the larger you are, the more resources you have. You can then forward fund and start having a pool of land that you can then better control your development, not the current model of actually you're building, you make sure you've sold it first before you then start looking at the new project. But once you've got that resource, you can forward plan, and that which is what happened in a lot of matured environment, that actually most developers, they land bank and they getting planning permission and all this other stuff to move the agenda going.
Interesting. That's that example. I'm definitely going to do some research on that afterwards, because there's a lot of, I guess, similarities between that and the housing market at the moment. And I think one thing that we often talk to is, like Marie O'Deal and Glenn talk about this all the time. It's almost like this limitless, like endless demand for affordable housing in Africa. And it seems like, affordable finance is a key part to really unlock that. So, I mean, a lot of businesses, they may have to face, question marks around, is there actually demand for this product? But it seems to be that the demand for affordable housing in Africa there's no question marks around, is there demand? The demand is there. It's just around creating the systems to really unlock that. And a key part of that is the affordable housing, the affordable finance, which is, I guess, specifically what we're trying to tackle.
Indeed. I mean, if you look at it from a wider macroeconomy, we go into recession when people talk about lack of consumer confidence, which is basically a lot of the time people do not have enough money in their pocket to buy goods and services. And so basically that is telling you that there's a correlation between an healthy economic system or an healthy real estate system or whatever system, when people have the means to buy. So this is basic economics. There's a difference between having the need and actually having the effective demand, which is that you have the means to exercise that particular need. And what we're seeing in a lot of African countries is that the absence of affordable housing finance delays and also constrains the market in a significant way.
Okay, I'd love to maybe go into the affordable housing company and give that a bit of an intro for those. I know, Olu, we did a bit of an intro a while back, but for those that missed that podcast, what's the mission for the affordable housing company? What inspired the company's focus on affordable housing in Nigeria and Sub-Saharan Africa?
I mean, it's very simple. Our mission is to expand delivery of, as we've said it, to expand delivery of affordable housing across Africa. And recently, I will also say affordable green housing, because the reality is that, as you well know, climate change is having disproportionate effect in a lot of parts of Africa. The reality is also that housing is a major contributor to carbon emission. So if the vision is to expand housing supply in Africa, then we need to make sure that we have an inbuilt adaptation measures to ensure that actually the new housing we're building is green, so we don't have to retrofit them in the future, even though there's still a huge gap in the retrofit market in terms of existing properties. So we've also felt it's actually we need to adapt and adopt the green agenda in terms of TAHCo. So expanding, but just not expanding affordable housing. I think what we also thought we wanted to do was to create places people want to live, places where they want to work. Increasingly, with a lot of people working from home, also people places they want to work, where they want to bring up their children. So it's always been that ambition that we want to not only provide affordable housing, but do it taking into account a lot of the disparate skills and expertise of the founders of the affordable housing company. And most of us that founded the company, we all we have a unique common experience that our background is that we're sort of steeped in the housing sector in the UK. We have a long history of understanding how the housing sector in the UK work, and also understanding of the particular issues across Africa in terms of delivering affordable housing. So we've always sought to act as a bridge from a diaspora effect of bringing our expertise, knowledge, and skills, but at the same time recognizing that it needs to be adapted to the local conditions and local constraints that we face in Africa. So it's been an interesting journey. We now have our first project in Abuja. We also acquired a site in Ghana. But in terms of the Abuja project, we're building 100 homes. We launched sales of that about a couple of weeks ago. It's been a labor of love sometimes, and it's been painstaking and a lot of hard work. But we think we're making progress, and obviously we've latterly, since his retirement, brought someone like Femi to help us in terms of his local knowledge and understanding of the market to help translate our dreams into reality. So that's and the other thing is just we're also very keen to these are soft issues, but things like governance, things like creating a sustainable institution is also one of the things that is driving us, so that the organization is built on strong foundations, other than just we do one single project and then we pack it in. We want to be sustainable, we want to be in the long term. We think part of that is putting in place strong foundations, which governance is one of them.
Yeah.
And also recruiting talented people, really.
In terms of, I guess, work moving forward, can you speak to some of the strategies at the Affordable Housing Company that is based around bridging that gap between supply and demand in Nigeria? How are you guys thinking about, I guess, approaching that challenge of bridging the gap between supply and demand?
Okay, so let me try and come in there. I think one of the things I'll add to what Olu has said about the DNA for the Affordable Housing Company in a market like this has to be the capacity to be nimble and innovate. On the project, particularly the startup project in Nigeria, is been around innovation on a couple of fronts. And one of those key fronts around which we're innovating is both on the bridging the gap between the demand and the supply. So just very briefly, what are we doing on those two ends? So on the supply end, at the very beginning of the project, we engaged with a cooperative society. So we have about 72,000 of them in Nigeria, but these are big vehicles across sub-Saharan Africa with the capacity to mobilize people, mobilize savings. And I think that one of the ideas that we had was working with cooperatives to establish a viable demand base for the houses that we build. Okay, so in the absence of a mortgage, how do you organize cooperatives? How do you organize saving schemes with them so that they can then buy the houses that are built. But more significantly, the early engagement with these cooperatives also enables us to get a sense for what kind of houses should we be building, where should we be building it, and at what price should we be building them, essentially ensuring that supply aligns with demand. And that is what we have done on this first project, which meant that when we went in, we had a reasonable assurance that all of the 100 homes we were looking to build were contracted to be bought by pre-identified people. So on the demand side, that is what we're doing. But that actually drives everything, because it meant that in building on the supply side and closing this gap, we weren't going to go and build a $30,000 home or $40,000 homes, because we knew that the demand side could not afford that. So we built homes or are building homes that was actually engineered and designed to the taste, but also the affordability of a pre-identified demand port. And I think that that is an innovation. We're not there yet, but we will continue to press on that particular channel with a view to bringing the demand side and the supply side a little bit closer together.
Mm-hmm. One interesting chart that I saw a little while ago was a chart that was showing Nigeria's population as being the growth of that, and how it's kind of growing at a rapid rate, and how by 2050, I think, is projected to be the third most populated country in the world.
Absolutely.
In terms of affordable housing, how do you think about that and the opportunities and challenges that come with that sort of a population growth trend?
Well, the challenges are enormous. By 2050, we'll have a population of just over 400 million people. What is more interesting is that about 70% of those are likely to be young people below the age of 35. So big opportunity. So I think the challenge in terms of leveraging, being able to access those opportunities is, how do we address the systemic challenges that you started this conversation with? How do we address ensuring that land is available for affordable housing? Because with an increasing population and rapid urbanization, there's going to be big pressure on land. How do we address access and availability to affordable long-term housing finance? How do we create institutions that money wants to flow to? And those are the things that the Affordable Housing Company wants to do. We want to create a strong institution, and I think partnership with the likes of Empowa are really part of the steps that the company is taking towards that end. We've got to ensure that we create a company that finance can flow and finds acceptable to flow to. And we want to have relationships with partners that gives access to the land that is needed to build housing.
Interesting. There's probably, time is running out, so there's probably one closing question that I'd love to get your opinion on. Essentially, it's kind of open-ended, but what message would you like to leave our listeners with regards to the future of affordable housing in Nigeria and broadly Africa as well? What kind of closing messages do you want to leave the listeners? So we'll go to both of you.
Okay, I think from my perspective, I think as Femi suggested and you mentioned, the reality is that there is an housing crisis. There's a significant growth in population. There's growth in urbanization. if I'm looking at what's happening in other African countries, I think there's a growing political realization from governments that these issues cannot be abandoned or ignored. We've had some successes. Family Homes Fund is an example of a housing fund that was set up from scratch that has made a significant difference in a short period of time. So we do have examples that where there's political commitment, where there's focus, and where we put up the right teams together, and we're trying to tackle some of these underlying issues, we can generate a lot of success. So whilst we've talked about some of the challenges, I have an optimistic outlook in the sense that I know also from my vast experience of working in the UK, a number of the markets we're comparing, the African markets, were not built overnight. The UK matured housing markets has been, in terms of recent history, is over 100 years old. So some of the, but obviously because of the challenges we currently face in Africa or in Nigeria, there's a need to accelerate some of the policies and some of the progress that needs to be made. But one shouldn't, so whilst it's a daunting prospect, it's one I think we embrace with gusto and think that over time we'll be able to play with support from investors, support from governments. We should have a fair chance of being successful with.
Femi?
Okay, look, I think I totally agree with Olu. I think that what I see is incredible opportunity. But to crystallize those opportunities, significant amount of work is required by the public sector, i.e. governments, and the private sector and entrepreneurs. But I think for the will for that work to happen, there needs to be a big change in perspective, that there is a tendency to see housing as a social activity. But actually, I think given the number of houses that we have to build in Africa over the next 25 years, and the supply and value chain that sits behind housing, it has to be a major lever of economic development for the African continent in terms of the jobs that it can create, in terms of the industrialization that it can stimulate, and the impact on quality of life, health, and education. So I think if housing is seen in a much broader perspective, in fact, as an economic development necessity, we're likely to get the kind of attention from government and organized private sector to take that market to the next level.